It's the week ending Saturday, the 10th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Britain's election result in a hung parliament, the former FBI director James Comey testifying at the Senate, and yet another terrorist attack in the UK, this time in London. And this week, in a break with tradition, we're going to talk about exactly those stories because, whilst there is still news not making headlines right now, well, these stories are going to have repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And with me today, from the week's digital team, are Arion McNicoll, Rebecca Gillie and Jonathan Harwood, who stayed up the longest watching the election last night. Just a show of hands, Jonathan.
2 hours sleep.
2 hours sleep. Can anyone better that?
No, I got about 5.
5? That's a normal night for me. Well, Arion, you're starting the show with your pick of the week. What have you brought with you?
Right, so here's someone who's really struggling being the new guy at work.
The president's new at this. He's new to government. And so he probably wasn't steeped in the long-running protocols that establish the relationships between DOJ, FBI, and White Houses. He's just new to this. And so I think what I got out of that testimony is we now know why he was so frustrated when the FBI director told him 3 times there's no investigation of him, yet that speculation was allowed to continue. So obviously we know now why he was frustrated.
House Speaker Paul Ryan talking to reporters after James Comey's testimony to the Senate Intelligence Committee. Arion, this was kind of the biggest story, obviously, in a lot of the English-speaking world, but not here because we were focusing on the election. So what happened on Thursday?
So on Thursday, James Comey, the former director of the FBI, appeared before the Senate Intelligence Committee and gave his version of events surrounding his ousting from office by President Donald Trump. It was pretty primetime TV for obvious reasons, and really it unearthed a whole lot of new information. And also, we got to see Comey untethered for the first time and actually talking very freely about his treatment at the hands of Trump. But this was just the latest in a litany of missteps by the president in the last couple of months, including his total failure to introduce immigration controls, which are tied up in the courts. His executive order got sort of shot down by a range of different courts and is now heading towards the Supreme Court. His attempts to repeal and replace Obamacare, which are also stuck and struggling in the Senate this time. He's got through the House of Republicans, but it looks like it's going to be massively altered before it even manages to get through the Senate. And then, his relatively disastrous foreign tour that resulted in peace in the Middle East, in his view, but not according to pretty much everyone else.
Okay, but you say his failure. I mean, he's, in fairness to him, doing absolutely everything he can to implement the things that he said he would do. It's everyone else that's blocking him, isn't it? And if you're a Trump supporter, you look at what's been happening here, and this is another instance of that.
He is doing everything that he can, but that's almost too much, one might argue. And I think that that's what Paul Ryan's getting at when he says, look, give him a break, he's a new guy, he doesn't know how this works.
And that was the statement, wasn't it, that we played out as the clip, which was kind of extraordinary. Paul Ryan saying, essentially, he's not a politician, this bloke, so you can't hold him to the same standards as other politicians, even though he's the most powerful politician in the world. What do we think about that, Jonathan?
Well, I mean, he was voted in on a lot of promises which people said were unfulfillable, and it's turning out to be that way, isn't it? The Mexico War, for example, is pie in the sky, and is obviously, well, it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, does it? And Mexico certainly aren't going to pay for it. So I think what's happening is the promises that he glibly made on the campaign trail are, if not coming back to haunt him, then certainly proving a lot harder to perform than he'd expected. It's not business, is it? When he's in Trump Tower sitting on his throne, he can do whatever he likes.
I mean, some things, yes, like the wall on the border of Mexico, yeah, they're difficult to do. But stuff like repealing and replacing Obamacare should actually be possible, particularly when you control Congress and, you have a Republican clean sweep of government. And surely some inadequacy on his part.
Well, he doesn't run his businesses in a collegiate way, does he? He's in charge. He does the deal break. He shakes the hands. He's not used to having 300 people involved.
I think what we've really learned from, the Comey hearings has been that US president isn't really the kind of job you should be learning on the job. Obviously, he's not an experienced politician, so that's what drew people to him. So, he's going to make gaffes, and I think that's, to some extent, isn't going to necessarily have such long-term
Well,
repercussions.
let's talk about the specific gaffe then. Because
yes.
the context of this isn't a policy. It's him sitting down opposite James Comey at dinner and say, swear me your loyalty.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Now,
exactly...
that is just a gaffe, isn't it? I mean, it's like, it seems ridiculous if you know all about politics, but actually, if you have a non-politician there and he's used to running his business in that way, is it that weird that he would just sit down and say, look, I want your loyalty, I want you to be behind me?
But this is a problem, isn't it? Because it's not so much about policies, because even experienced politicians can't always enact their policies. We've talked about the Mexican wall. I mean, those are policies. And at the end of the day, if he can't push those things through that he promised, there are plenty of veteran politicians who can't push through the things they promise either. The wider thing that's really become clear with the Comey hearings is that he doesn't understand the principles behind it. As John was saying, that's not how he would run his business. He looks at the Paris Accords and he's like, well, what do we get out of it? The answer is really nothing, but he doesn't have any understanding of the principles, which is so much more dangerous than just not understanding, well, maybe you can't do what you promised.
But it's more than a gaffe as well, because what we've seen is that Trump wasn't under investigation by the inquiry looking into collaboration between Trump himself and the Russians. But he's made things harder for himself, because what he's done in firing Comey is actually put himself in the line of fire again, because now there's this potential obstruction of justice charge. So actually it is massively problematic, and it's more than just a gaffe.
But my question is, when he says to the director of the FBI, can I have your loyalty? To take your point, Rebecca, is the principle that he's misunderstanding, that the FBI can't swear allegiance to the president? I mean, is that so terrible that he misunderstands that?
Yeah, I think he thinks, I'm president of the USA, I run the USA, these people work for me.
Yeah.
It's like he's meeting one of his chief executives or something.
But that is bad. It's
Well,
bad
it's,
if he
it's
doesn't
an
get
example
that.
of what people who don't like Trump don't like about Trump. But I suppose what I'm getting at is, if you're pro-Trump, it doesn't change what you think about Trump. It's exactly the kind of guy you want in there, someone who's straight-talking, da-da-da.
It's interesting that Paul Ryan referred to it as a protocol as well, because it makes it clear that there are some things that are not necessarily codified in law. The exact relationship between the FBI, the Department of Justice, the White House is always just worked on the understanding, well, we all understand that obviously the White House shouldn't influence those investigations. And now we see what happens when someone comes in who says, well, it doesn't say that I can't do this.
But I mean, in him saying those things to Comey in that sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink way, he is actually trying to scupper an investigation that was potentially, if not looking into him directly, getting very close to him. So that's problematic. That is actually problematic. That's not just something that his supporters can actually get behind and go, oh, do you know what? It's about time we had someone who doesn't adhere to checks and balances as laid down by the founding forefathers. It's a bad idea. That's why you have a constitution.
And moving to generalities again then, if we're trying to get a repercussion out of this, if this kind of thing, this kind of caper coming out of Trump has influence on whether the anti-establishment voters all around the world look for candidates that aren't politicians again, what lessons might we learn here in the UK? Because we've just seen that actually the anti-establishment vote here can quite easily be picked up by a man who spent 30 plus years in politics.
I don't think there's much chance of a Trump figure rising up from nowhere in the UK, basically on account of the fact that we don't have a presidential system. You can have a maverick leader, but the party would never stand for it, as Corbyn's come about as close as you can get, and he sailed close to the wind. I think, actually, going back to Trump, though, I think the thing that he'll be judged on, he made a big song and dance about how he was a deals man. He was going to make a lot of deals, and he was going to be great for America and going to be great for everyone. What he's done since he's got in is tear up a lot of deals and then promise to renegotiate them, and then not.
Paris, when he was like,
precisely.
I'm ready to renegotiate, and they said, no thanks.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you apply, obviously, the rules of the business world to the world of politics. And it has laid bare as well just how fragile some of our assumptions are. We do assume that politicians will act in a certain way, that they'll be motivated by certain, dare I say, even principles, will guide some of their decisions and keep them reasonably in line. But as we're seeing now in the US, that's not necessarily a guarantee. No one's ever thought, let's make a law that the politicians can't talk in an incredibly shady way to the director of the FBI, because obviously who would even try to do that? Someone has, and someone can.
And there's the associates around him, aren't there? So one of the arguments that anti-Trump voters were apparently appeased with after Trump got elected was, well, don't worry, it'll be like George W. Bush and he'll surround himself by lifetime political people who will guide him in the right direction, and he'll be a Republican, but he won't be a complete maverick. Exactly. He has actually surrounded himself with mavericks as well.
Yeah, and
so they don't have the political experience.
You've got the James
Mattis. It's a mix.
Yeah, you've got the James Mattis, H.R. McMaster, Rex Tillerson, sensible adults in the room, but it seems like he's not listening to them. So maybe that's the problem, that you can't give the highest jobs to the guy who is the new guy, who doesn't have the experience.
Next up, it's John. What do you think this week's going to be remembered for?
Strong and stable leadership.
Here we go then, general election chat, strap in.
But yet again, I say to the right honourable gentleman, there is indeed a difference between us. It's very simple. When I look at the issue of Brexit, or indeed at any other issue like the National Health Service or social care, I consider the issue, I set out my plan, and I stick to it. It's called leadership. He should try it sometime.
U-turn if you want to. In fact, yeah, just go ahead. Theresa May there, speaking at Prime Minister's Questions back in April. Jonathan, after the campaign that she's had, clips like that, there are others, now sound deeply ironic.
It's poignant, isn't it? It's almost sad. Comes across like a sort of Bronte hero alone on a moor somewhere, abandoned.
I mean, it is extraordinary, isn't it? And no one predicted it. Everyone, every pundit, every politician, even the people in the Labour Party who were interviewed, all predicted that there would be a Tory majority. It was just a question of how big.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down, everyone's talking about the reasons for it. My opinion is that it's actually to do with leadership. And May made a big song and dance about her strong and stable leadership. But at the end of the day, she didn't really have any. I mean, the field we had to choose from this time round was pretty lame if you think about it. If you look back in history, when you look back on the runners and riders in this election, you're not going to say there were some colossuses in there, are you? If you look at 2015 even, that was considered a less than vintage field, and you had Cameron, Miliband, Clegg, Farage, Natalie Bennett, Nicola Sturgeon and Leanne Wood. Now, only two of them remained for the 2017 election. Half of the 2015 lot aren't even in politics anymore, particularly Nick Clegg after he asked last night.
Yeah.
We're not in an era of massive personalities and great leaders, I don't think, and that's probably one of the reasons that May was undone.
Well, but then there's nothing wrong, theoretically, with not having a really strong personality if you're a British political leader, because we're supposed to have a collegiate, cabinet-led, party-led system. The problem is that she decided to frame it around leadership because Jeremy Corbyn was perceived to be disastrous compared to her.
I mean, and Corbyn is having his Messiah moment.
His third Messiah moment, to be fair.
Well, yeah. I mean, both the two main leaders really are kind of accidental leaders, aren't they? I mean, May was never Prime Minister material. She was a sort of average Home Secretary who'd somehow got there, and no one's quite sure how she even got to Home Secretary. Corbyn spent 32 years as a resolute backbencher, terrified of getting anywhere near the cabinet.
But aren't we sort of slightly dangerously conflating leadership with charisma? Because I'd agree, certainly, that it's a pretty charisma-less field this time and last time, to 2015 as well. But actually, in terms of leadership, I think it's arguable that Corbyn laid out a pretty clear strategy. He's always stood for a particular set of principles, and he's sort of delivered on them to the extent that you can while still not being in government.
Yeah, but let's not forget that 2 months ago he was, on the verge of being ousted.
Sarah Wollaston, the Tory MP, said one thing that was very true and then one thing that was slightly sad. She said that people were turned off by the way that the Tories had made it personal and they'd used US-style attack ads attacking Jeremy Corbyn, which is very true. But then she said it ended up making people feel sorry for him. And I just thought, just as John was saying, if this is what passes for charisma, personality, people saying, oh, she's picked on him and now I feel sorry for him and maybe we should give him a chance. I mean, that was not him storming in and converting the masses. That's a Tory MP basically admitting that they had browbeaten Jeremy Corbyn so much that people felt sorry for him.
That's one element of it, isn't it? But I mean, that can't be the only reason why they held on to the heartlands, because those are areas where people might have been thinking about voting UKIP or they might have been thinking about voting Lib Dem, but they would never have voted Tory, but they chose to stick with Labour, and that's because they believed in Jeremy Corbyn. So it's not just as simple as they felt sorry for him.
Well, and I think a lot of it came down to, as John was saying, it was all around Theresa May's projection of being strong and stable. But, we never really seen any evidence of it. She had, in fairness, not that much had really come up where she could start swinging her weight. It was all about the build-up to Brexit, and she was going to be strong and stable.
She was going to be the new Iron Lady, wasn't she? And then she wasn't.
But it depends, doesn't it, what you're comparing it to? I mean, it seems to me the idea of Theresa May as a strong and stable leader came about because the pragmatic alternative to her was Michael Gove, who stabbed Boris Johnson in the back and then decided to stand, having said that he never would. Boris Johnson, who then ducked out because Michael Gove stood, and Andrea Leadsom, who no one had ever heard of.
Yeah,
so against that, she seemed very strong and stable, didn't she? She'd been in the cabinet, she knew what she was talking about, and she said, I want to do Brexit.
That's kind of my point. We're in an era of political pygmies almost, aren't we? I mean, none of these people are going to be writ large in history books.
Boris Johnson, if we are talking about charisma, he's a charismatic candidate. Actually, he's a terribly charismatic candidate in the
if Boris Johnson
all senses
became
of the word.
Prime Minister, spit, but if that did happen, there would be, wouldn't there? If you zoomed out historically and ignored policy and just looked at personalities, I think you'd say probably Thatcher, Blair, Johnson, wouldn't you, in terms of who made an impact?
Yeah, and he's the only one who actually probably has the ambition to lead the country. I'm not sure that Corbyn ever did. May, I don't think, ever did. What's his name? Farron?
Tim Farron,
yes. I mean, even Clegg probably didn't. It's, Johnson at least wants to be in charge.
But then that's the thing, though, isn't it? Not to return to Trump, but we've seen what going after the big personalities, where that can take you. Would this election, I think we're all fed up to the back teeth of it, would this election have been any better if it had been run on the exact same issues and policies, but it had a couple of characters?
If you'd had a couple of heavyweights, I would have been intrigued to see how the campaign would have unfolded if it had been Umana against Johnson.
Yeah, that would definitely have been.
Or even Ed
more
Balls or someone,
entertaining.
Or Yvette Cooper.
Well, he's been busy.
But that's the question, isn't it? I think for Labour supporters is, of course, they're even though they've lost, they're thrilled that they haven't lost really badly and that they've gained seats, and no one expected that. But at the same time, you have to wonder if it had been Ed Balls or Yvette Cooper or sort of anyone, would they have done better with the same manifesto?
The Corbyn supporters are all phrasing it as, imagine what had happened if you hadn't been so rude to Jeremy Corbyn. Imagine how well we would have done, considering how well we have done.
Yeah.
The other way of looking at it is imagine if it wasn't Jeremy Corbyn.
Realistically, we have the opportunity ahead of us to have some more leadership.
Yes, but how far ahead of us do we think?
Well,
you're talking about another election?
Yeah, or the rolling of Theresa May and her being rumbled and getting someone in without an election.
The public aren't going to have a say in that, though, are we? Yeah. But how? So make a prediction. I enjoy doing this because Holden successfully predicted Macron, so now you've got a pretty strong competitor here. Predict when's the next general election?
About 10:30 last night, I predicted that Johnson would be leading the Tory party into another election in November.
All right, there you are. Wow. It's timed, that prediction. Anyone else care to...
I think that's pretty good. I don't know about the timing of the election, but I reckon we'll have Bojo before the end of the year.
But actually, didn't the lesson of Corbyn teach us it won't be Boris Johnson, it'll be someone you'll never expect?
Yeah,
someone
possibly.
you've never heard of, won't it?
I think it doesn't really matter either way, because what's happening is we're just trying to fill this hole that's never going to be filled, because what people want is someone who can get that Brexit deal. And it's looking more and more like we're not going to get anything like it. We want someone who's going to get the impossible. And Theresa May was happy to keep saying that she'd get it. And I think it's increasingly looking like we're certainly not going to get the kind of deal that has been painted. And it doesn't matter, what kind of character we end up electing. Personality is kind of almost a smokescreen.
OK, so let's talk about that issue. Why weren't there details on Brexit? That seems weird, doesn't it? That always did seem weird. It's an election about Brexit. We still don't know what people are voting for.
Someone who's very keen on, as a Home Secretary, who's very keen on snooping. Theresa May is very sort of opaque about things she thinks, isn't she?
No, none of the main three parties are led by someone who supported the campaign to leave. So, in a way...
except possibly Labour.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if any of the three main party leaders, Corbyn's probably the one who was most likely to have voted leave.
And I suppose that answers your question for why we didn't get any detail out of Labour on what they intended to do with Brexit, because really they didn't actually want to talk about it too much. As for why May didn't spell it out, what she says is that she needed to go to the negotiations without actually showing her hand at all. As to whether anyone could achieve anything, even if you did reveal exactly what your intention was right up front, who knows?
The lack of a sidekick as well was really striking. Where were the chancellors during the election campaign? 2010, there was a chancellor's debate on TV. This time round, I've forgotten what Philip Hammond looks like.
And that was an issue because they're the Conservatives. They were supposed to be about, restoring the public books and all of that. So why do you think that decision was obviously it's easy to say in retrospect it's a bad decision, but why do you think the decision was taken not to discuss the economy?
Focus on Brexit? But then focus on something that you haven't really got in focus. So it was strange.
And
Brexit means Brexit.
Well,
it's focused enough for me. It's 2 words in that sentence.
Yeah, that's one thing though. Both the manifestos were criticised for not being costed. The Labour's tax rises and how all the parties were going to fund all their ideas. That all came under fire. But yet, even then, you did not see hide nor hair, really, of McDonnell or Hammond.
And to go back to your original point, Rebecca, about people feeling sorry for Jeremy Corbyn, I'm interested in that because is a lesson from that that negative campaigning just won't work in the UK when it's based around personality in that way, because there's genuinely an element of the British character which is we always vote for the guy on Britain's Got Talent who's a bit rubbish and he's got a deaf dog or whatever, because that's what we like. We like supporting people who are a bit hopeless in a way, and we do like a story, and we don't like people who are arrogant and swaggering.
Yeah, and I think that Labour were wise to, they made quite a lot of hay out of the supposed arrogance of Theresa May and the Tories. And I think they did certainly tap into a feeling that the way he was being treated wasn't fair, especially given that we don't have a presidential system and it shouldn't be about the leaders.
And I think Labour, towards the end, conned on to the idea that people want to get behind a grand design, and they belatedly kind of got that together and started running with it.
But equally, you saw a real turnaround through the course of the campaign, where by the end, Corbyn was looking increasingly confident and fiery, and it was May who was suddenly being tipped as the sort of shy, gaffe-prone, not underdog. She was never the underdog, but there were personality failings that.
It's like a boxing match. It would have been Corbyn looking for the fight and May trying to duck out of it.
Exactly, and it was.
Okay, can we move on? Jez, we can. Rebecca, what have you brought with you this week?
It turns out that mutually assured destruction isn't the vote winner it used to be.
The woman there, yes. Let's just stick with this, then we'll move on. Yes?
Yeah, I actually have a question regarding human rights, but...
All right, use your question.
Just before, I don't understand why everyone in this room seems so keen on killing millions of people with a nuclear bomb.
A memorable moment from the BBC's Question Time special, where an unnamed member of the audience became exasperated over Trident and the question of whether Corbyn would push the button. This was after about 10 minutes of the audience hectoring Jeremy Corbyn, basically saying, do it, push the button. Why did you choose this clip, Rebecca?
I think it revealed something. I mean, obviously the big talking points in this election cycle have been Brexit, the NHS, schools' budgets. But I think foreign policy has kind of been overlooked in the sense that the Tories clearly went in thinking this was their race in the hole. Corbyn would never be able to come back on issues of security and foreign policy. It's perceived as weak, and people were looking for a strong leader, especially, with the tragic terror attacks. That kind of reinforced that idea. But I think they have seriously misjudged it, because that is not actually the way that people think. For instance, when Jeremy Corbyn made his speech at Chatham House and laid out his foreign policy, if you read the tabloid press, you'd have got the impression he'd made this enormous taboo by suggesting that Western military intervention could be contributing to the terror risk at home. The Tories have seized on that, obviously, as well, but they would have done well to look at the YouGov poll that came out on the 26th of May, and it found that on average, 53% of people agreed, compared to, I think it was 24% who didn't agree that Western intervention had exacerbated the terror risk in the UK. And that wasn't just a case of young people coming out of Corbyn. Every single age group, at least 50% of people agreed with that proposition. And I think it's something that the Tories have seriously overlooked. And in my mind, it comes back to the legacy of the Iraq War. Our mainstream politicians, both Tories and Labour, in general, voted in favour of that war. And since then, they've been trying to brush the legacy kind of under the carpet. And the idea, if you bring up that might have exacerbated things, you're suddenly attacked as being a victim-blaming terrorist sympathiser. Jeremy Corbyn has clean hands on that issue. And he's been one of the first mainstream politicians to come out and say, we messed everything up. And I think it's refreshing, and people do still remember, and they do want to hear that message.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think people do still suffer from Iraq fatigue. It's hovered over British politics for so long now, and it's become a sort of malignant spectre that hangs over everything, isn't it? And it's hard not to see the link between Islamic State, and which is now on our doorstep, and what happened under Blair. So, putting two and two together isn't rocket science. People are clever enough to have done it themselves already, and just to point it out isn't a great taboo anymore. And I think Corbyn was correct to link the two, and to deny it's happening is naive.
And also the SNP, despite the blows they've suffered, remain the largest party in Scotland. So they've won 2 elections in Scotland talking about abolishing Trident. So it's not as if that's an obscure policy north of the border, is it? I mean, the fact that Corbyn doesn't want to press the button, well, neither does Nicola Sturgeon. She doesn't even want the button to exist.
Yeah. And Corbyn, of course, him personally anti-Trident, but the Labour manifesto has Trident in it, and he's been overruled by the party on that front, and it's still going to be divisive.
And weirdly, that sort of made him look stronger. I mean, the whole point of those arguments was to make him look weaker. You wouldn't press the button, you wouldn't do it, you wouldn't do the first attack. But actually what he was saying was, I represent a party and our policy is to have Trident. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable pressing the button. And actually that made him look like he listens to people, which actually played in his favour, arguably.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the mistakes was that Corbyn was given enough time in the campaign to make his positions a lot clearer. And I think that backfired slightly on the Tories, because I think the whole thing with Trident and nuclear sum and that kind of thing is kind of issue that the average voter doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about. It's very hypothetical compared to issues like the NHS. And I think the Tories underestimated how open people were to change their mind on that topic, because it's one of those things, you hear it. If someone says to you, Jeremy Corbyn wants to get rid of our nuclear weapons, the only thing that's stopping someone from nuking us, your first reaction is, well, that's terrible, he shouldn't do that. But once he's given a chance to lay out his position, just like the woman on Question Time, the average person thinks, well, if we were to press a button, the whole world would essentially be destroyed. So it's not, I think people are much more open to changing their minds on that when they hear more details than they are on issues like, say, the NHS.
But he does have form supporting the IRA. That was something that we always knew was going to come along in the media campaign, because it came along when he was in the race to be elected both times, leader of the Labour Party. And the Daily Mail ran a front page picture of him saying terrorists just a few days before the election. But that didn't seem to resonate. Why is that? Why have the British apparently forgotten about the IRA?
Well, I don't know. There might be a slightly different issue at play there. I mean, I'm sure it did play with the Daily Mail readers, but they weren't part of his catchment area.
Okay, why doesn't it matter to Corbyn voters that he supported the IRA?
A lot of them are young. I mean, one of my earliest memories is seeing about the Good Friday Agreement on TV. That's one of my earliest memories of watching the news. And, a lot of the people, I'm 26, and a lot of people who came out to vote for Corbyn were younger than that. And I think to them, they wouldn't be able to pick Sinn Féin leaders out of a lineup, and they certainly don't have any kind of visceral memory of what that time was like.
And equally, maybe we're seeing the diminishing power of the Daily Mail front page as well. That idea that you could, frankly, slander someone with a 13-page editorial piece on whatever political point you want to make. Suddenly, it doesn't seem like those tabloids are swaying elections anymore the way they used to.
Let's talk about The Sun, because they got it wrong, rarely. Because there was the sign, wasn't there, at the last election, maybe they were losing their touch. Have they lost it? Can The Sun win it for anyone anymore?
You'd have to say probably not. I mean, the campaign was fought on social media, and we spoke about it on this podcast, I think, before the campaign or during the campaign, about how letters through your letterbox aren't the way of getting through to people anymore. It's on your Facebook feed. I don't get a lot of stuff from The Sun on my Facebook feed.
And arguably polls aren't the way to find out what people are thinking, because young people don't answer the door and talk to pollsters.
Because they're in bed eating pot noodles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And taking pictures of them and sharing them.
But that's nice. I remember there was an article in Huffington Post UK which was talking about the kind of Labour surge in the polls, and there was an anonymous Tory MP who said, these young people will talk about how much they like Jeremy Corbyn, but they won't get off their lazy asses and vote for him. And that has proven to be, like you say, young people don't get their news from the newspapers, don't get their news from tabloid headlines, probably don't even see it in their Facebook feed. If this trend continues and young people keep voting in the future at that kind of rate, then the power of The Sun, the Daily Mail, etc., is going to take a serious, very sudden hit.
But if your macro point is The Sun's power is diminished, does that necessarily mean that Rupert Murdoch's power is massively diminished? I mean, don't forget that he's a pretty massive stakeholder in Vice media, and that has the kind of content that definitely is designed to reach people that are frankly younger than all of us in this room. So his power to impact elections goes on. It's just not necessarily going to be with the Sun newspaper.
Well, hold on a minute. Before we disappear too much up our own media cavities here, part of what you do here at The Week is you consume all these different media outlets and you weigh them all up and what their different perspectives are. It's not just the case that the Sun was very anti-Corbyn and the Mail was very anti-Corbyn. It's that even the Daily Mirror expressed a preference in the vote of no confidence in him. No one was pro-Corbyn. Will that change? Will anyone in the mainstream media come out and be Corbynites now?
Yes, and it already has, because Owen Jones a couple of weeks ago was saying it's time for Jeremy Corbyn to leave the party, and just this morning he was saying he's going to make a fantastic prime minister. So
That's
it's already
comment. Owen
shift.
Jones is not he's a sort of personal brand, isn't he? He's a columnist, but it's not the Guardian saying great, vote for Jeremy Corbyn,
because they're now in a position. They're not kingmakers yet, but they're in a position to influence national policy more than they certainly were before. I think the Guardian are going to say, right, we can lean on these guys.
And equally, you've seen the centrist elements of the Labour Party moving increasingly towards hey, that Jeremy Corbyn guy's okay position. And where they go, surely media outlets will follow. I can easily see it, yeah.
I don't think he's ever going to be, the darling of the press. But I think what we learned last night is that doesn't necessarily matter. And I think going forward it's going to matter even less.
One final thing on Corbyn and how he comes across in the media, because I've interviewed him. He's really boring when you talk to him face to face. I mean, he's really dry. He trips over his words. He's very intricate and intellectual. He's like a really sweet guy, and very honest and sincere, but really humourless. Why is it that when he's on the stump, he comes across fiery and excited and gets people fired up? And then the reality is, when he's leader of the Labour Party over the next however long it is to the next general election, he goes back to coming across really badly again. What is that?
I mean, Prime Minister's questions was hardly a barrel of laughs, isn't it? But then when you saw him on some of the pre-election interviews, he seemed really relaxed. I don't know if he's had deluge of media coaching or something like that. Maybe they've got someone in.
The contrast actually plays in his favour as well, because when you look at the polls, the number one word that people associate with him is honest. And when people do see that contrast, they do seem to come to life when it comes to politics. And I think, in a way, the boringness works because it serves to highlight that there is that contrast. He's not the most interesting person, but he honestly cares a lot about what he does. And I think that does resonate with people.
Well, let's never rely on the fact that boringness can work here on this show. That is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. Breathe out, everyone. It's okay. It's the weekend. The election's over for now. My thanks to Arion McNicoll, Rebecca Gillie and Jonathan Harwood. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk? You can download our free iPhone app, The Weekday, or, of course, you can get the magazine direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And you can find this podcast on all podcast apps of varying quality. Just search for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann, our music is by Tom Morby, and the producer is Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week and discover who the Prime Minister is, bye-bye.